Dawn crept over the wreckage of southern Germany in the spring of 1945, the pale light sliding across roofless homes, broken streets, and the silent shells of factories that once fed the Reich. A thin mist clung to the ground outside a newly established American processing camp, its wire fences still smelling of fresh metal, its guard towers manned by young soldiers who had not yet grown used to the quiet. After months of shelling and flight, the sudden stillness felt unnatural. Inside the perimeter, German women, many widowed, many hungry, all exhausted, rose from their first uninterrupted night of sleep in weeks. They had expected rough treatment, suspicion, perhaps punishment. Instead, they found warm food, clean cots, medical inspection, and guards who spoke firmly but without cruelty. For the first time since their world collapsed, there were no bombs, no desperate crowds, no fear of roving bands or approaching front lines. When an officer stepped forward and announced that civilians would soon be escorted back to their towns, a ripple moved through the crowd. Women shook their heads, stepped closer, some even pleading in halting English. They did not want to leave the gates behind, and their reaction revealed a truth the Americans had not yet grasped, one that shaped everything that followed. In the final months of the war, Germany had become a landscape moving in slow collapse. Town governments dissolved, postal routes vanished, rail lines were choked with fleeing civilians, and entire districts were cut off from any organized authority. By early 1945, most German cities were no longer functioning societies but wounded bodies surviving on instinct. Women carried the weight of this collapse more than anyone. With millions of men dead, missing, or captured, it was women who stood in the bread queues, searched for missing children, and whispered prayers that the front would pass them by. But the front never passed quietly. The Allied bombing campaign had reduced urban centers to rubble, leaving families digging for water beneath shattered mains and gathering firewood from collapsed beams. Hunger spread faster than fear. Ration cards printed by the dying Reich meant little when the supply system itself no longer existed. In many cities, what food remained was taken by retreating units or stolen by those strong enough to seize it. Nights were the worst. Without electricity, most streets were swallowed in darkness. Rumors of looters, some foreign laborers freed when camps were overrun, some desperate locals moved from door to door. Women, already bruised by years of war, now braced themselves against chaos that felt endless. When American forces crossed the Rhine and swept through Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg, they entered a society that had disintegrated faster than any official report could capture. Surrender did not bring order, it exposed the void beneath. In many towns, the first sound civilians heard after the shooting ended was not celebration but the sharp cry of children begging for bread. The U.S. Army, trained for combat, now faced the unexpected task of stabilizing a civilian population of tens of millions. Commanders requisitioned empty Wehrmacht barracks, schools, and abandoned factories to create temporary holding areas, places where displaced persons, refugees, and civilians could be processed, identified, or kept safe until the surrounding region regained some measure of control. These facilities were not designed as sanctuaries. They were administrative tools meant to bring clarity to the aftermath of a collapsing state. Yet to the civilians who arrived, they represented the first organized structure they had seen in months. Women entered them worn down by sleepless nights and gnawing hunger. Many had walked miles with infants tied to their backs, clutching small bundles that held everything they had left. Some came voluntarily, hoping the Americans might offer help. Others were gathered during sweeps of unstable districts, where military police tried to keep civilians from wandering into minefields or looted zones. The first hours inside were always quiet. Shock settled over the newcomers. They expected harshness shaped by years of propaganda depicting the Allies as destroyers, but instead they were given simple tasks: register names, list family members, hand over weapons if any were carried. Medical personnel checked for injuries and diseases that had spread during the weeks of flight. Translators, some German Jews who had returned with American units, moved gently among the lines, guiding civilians through the process. Food was issued in measured portions, simple but warm dishes that tasted like another world after months of scarcity. For many women, the most disarming moment came at night. The lights stayed on, guards patrolled. The camp hummed with controlled activity, not fear. Mothers slept without clutching their children in terror. Young women closed their eyes without bracing for intruders. It was the contrast more than anything that broke them, the realization of how far their lives had fallen, and how strange it felt to experience safety again, even behind wire fences. Outside the perimeter, their hometowns waited in ruins. Roofs blown off, water pumps destroyed, streets filled with debris, and neighborhoods stripped of anything edible. Returning meant stepping back into a world where there was no guarantee of warmth, food, or protection. Inside the American camp, however imperfect, order existed. And it was this difference that would soon lead to the scenes that stunned the young guards who watched from their towers, unsure how to respond to the pleas rising from the people they had been trained to view as the defeated enemy. The U.S. occupation authorities understood that the peace would be as complex as the war. The German state had evaporated almost overnight. There were no functioning ministries, few intact police departments, and millions of civilians adrift without guidance. American planners had anticipated surrender, but they had not anticipated a humanitarian landscape so vast, so chaotic, and so dependent on their decisions. The objective was stability, not punishment. The war was won, now order had to be restored. In the American zones, military governance focused first on preventing disease, starvation, and disorder. A strict rationing system was established to limit black market trading and ensure that food reached the most vulnerable. Warehouses filled with U.S. Army supplies became lifelines for entire towns. Medical teams set up temporary clinics, treating everything from infected wounds to pneumonia that had swept through families sheltering in cellars. Engineers raced to repair water mains, reopen roads, and clear unexploded ordnance. Where German police forces were considered unreliable or compromised by their association with the old regime, American military police took direct control, patrolling streets that had not known stability in months. Amid this transition, the temporary camps, some originally designed for processing, others adapted for the displaced, became central nodes in the rebuilding effort. Inside them, records could be kept, identities confirmed, and civilians sorted according to need or vulnerability. These camps were never intended to serve German civilians extensively, but necessity shifted their purpose. In many towns, they became the only place where food, safety, and clarity existed in the same space. Word spread quickly. Women whispered to neighbors that the Americans provided blankets, or that the doctors treated their children without asking for bribes or favors, or that the guards did not break down doors in the night. For civilians who had endured years of propaganda, discovering that the occupying forces were firm but not brutal was disorienting. Some reacted with suspicion, others with suppressed relief. Gradually, a new reality crept in. Within these controlled environments, life felt more predictable than beyond the gates. The contrast was especially stark when compared to stories leaking from the east. Refugees from territories overtaken by the Red Army arrived with tales of violence, retribution, and uncontrolled reprisals. Many were terrified to return home, unsure whether their villages even existed anymore. To them, the American zones represented not just stability but the possibility of rebuilding a future. Even women from regions untouched by Soviet advances feared what awaited them outside the perimeter. In ruined towns, local economies had collapsed, bakeries stood empty, schools were unheated, many women had not seen fresh vegetables or clean water in weeks. The simple routine of a U.S. camp, lined up meals, regular patrols, warm buildings, felt like a fragile oasis. Yet from the American perspective, keeping healthy civilians inside these facilities indefinitely was neither practical nor intended. The camps were strained already, balancing displaced persons liberated from concentration camps, prisoners of war awaiting repatriation, forced laborers desperate to return home, and the sick who needed longer care. Every cot used by a healthy local civilian meant one less cot available for someone who had nowhere else to go. The U.S. command faced a dilemma. Compassion could not override the need to manage post-war Europe efficiently. Still, the soldiers who interacted with the civilians saw something that reports rarely captured. They saw how tightly women clung to their children when told they would be leaving. They noticed the subtle panic when officials explained that ration cards would be distributed in town halls, not inside the camp. They heard the quiet questions: would there be food? Would the streets be safe? Would the night bring terror again? For many of these women, the phrase, "don't leave us here," was not a plea to stay in confinement but a plea to remain in the one place where life felt bearable. Their towns, once symbols of order and routine, had become unfamiliar and threatening. Inside the camp, meals arrived on time. Outside, nothing was certain. And as the Americans prepared to carry out new directives for civilian release, they were about to confront the depth of that fear in a way that changed their understanding of occupation overnight. The human side of this moment was impossible for the soldiers to ignore. When the camp gates opened each morning, more civilians gathered outside, not trying to break in but hoping to be let in. Women who had walked miles stood in quiet lines, holding infants wrapped in threadbare blankets or leading children who were barefoot despite the cold. They were not begging for special treatment. They were begging for structure, for predictability, for something they had not known in months: safety. The first night inside an American camp was often the first night a woman slept without listening for distant artillery or footsteps on broken stairs. It was the first time she didn't fear being robbed, harmed, or thrust back into the chaos beyond the fence. For many, it brought an emotional collapse they had delayed for far too long. Tears came not from sorrow but relief, the kind that arrives only when the body finally believes it is no longer in danger. Psychologically, this shift was profound. These women were not meeting the Americans as enemies but as the first stable authority they had seen since their towns fell apart. They were exhausted, shaken by war's final months, and stripped of the illusions that had once held the Reich together. Their reactions were not rooted in politics but in sheer survival instinct. Stability, even when administered by foreign soldiers, felt miraculous. After years of propaganda warning them of destruction, brutality, and vengeance, they were unprepared for the reality of organized, rule-bound military governance. The fear that had shaped their expectations dissolved into confusion, and confusion quickly became dependence. Many struggled with the emotional contradiction. The army that occupied their land was also the force providing their first sense of safety since the war began. The familiar had become dangerous, the foreign had become secure. That fragile contradiction shaped every interaction that followed. For the American soldiers, these scenes were equally disorienting. They had trained for combat, not social collapse. They were prepared to face hostility, sabotage, or resistance. Instead, they encountered women thanking them shyly for hot soup, children saluting them awkwardly, and civilians asking to remain behind barbed wire because the world outside felt too unstable to survive. Some soldiers felt sympathy, others felt irritation, believing their job was to maintain order, not run a humanitarian refuge. Younger men, those barely out of high school, found themselves in positions of authority they had never imagined. They carried rifles in one hand while handing out rations with the other. They enforced rules to prevent fraternization while managing civilians who saw them as the only reliable figures in a shattered landscape. Their reports home conveyed a mix of pride and disbelief. It was strange, they wrote, to see former enemies looking to them for protection. Strange to watch German women weep at the thought of leaving an American-run compound. Strange to realize that the war they had fought so fiercely had ended in responsibility, not departure. The soldiers began to understand that victory did not simply mean ending the fighting. It meant steadiness, discipline, compassion, and a willingness to hold together a society that had fallen apart faster than anyone expected. Inside the camps, these three angles, human suffering, psychological shock, and the soldiers' unexpected burden, intertwined into a moment of history that was as fragile as it was revealing. And as commanders continued to push civilians back toward their ruined homes, the tension between policy and humanity grew sharper with each passing day. The logistical demands behind these camps formed a fourth angle, one that rarely reached the civilians who passed through their gates. The U.S. Army had not prepared to run full-scale relief centers for German populations. Its supply lines were already strained by the need to feed troops, maintain occupation headquarters, and support millions of displaced persons liberated from forced labor or concentration camps. Every blanket issued to a German woman, every bowl of soup ladled to a child, was drawn from a system meant to support an entirely different mission. Officers struggled to balance necessity with practicality. They requisitioned buildings that still stood, converted Wehrmacht facilities into sorting stations, and assigned clerks to manage endless lines of frightened civilians seeking documentation. Food stocks had to be guarded carefully, medical supplies rationed. These facilities were not built to be permanent havens. They were stopgaps, temporary structures holding together a country that had no functioning institutions left. The moral dimension formed the fifth angle, one that weighed heavily on American commanders. They were under strict orders to avoid any impression of favoritism or leniency that might encourage dependence or undermine the broader goals of demilitarization and denazification. At the same time, they could not ignore the reality unfolding at their gates. Women who had lost everything were asking for protection, not privilege. Children too weak to stand were being held upright by mothers who could barely stand themselves. Officers had to judge, sometimes within minutes, who needed urgent help and who could be redirected back into town. Every decision carried consequences. Too much compassion risked overwhelming the camps, too little risked sending vulnerable people back into danger. Some officers questioned whether the Army's policies fully accounted for the collapse they were witnessing. Others insisted that boundaries must remain firm or the occupation would become unmanageable. Between these two forces, duty and empathy, the line grew thinner every day. The final angle was geopolitical, shaped by the emerging divide between East and West. Refugees arriving from territories now under Soviet control often described conditions far worse than anything in the American zone. They spoke of reprisals, forced removals, and the chaos that followed as Germany fractured into emerging spheres of influence. Whether every story was accurate or colored by fear did not matter to those hearing them. What mattered was the growing belief that the American zone, despite shortages and strict rules, offered a kind of stability that no other part of occupied Germany could match. This perception influenced movement across the devastated landscape. It shaped how civilians approached American guards, how they interpreted the camps, and why some clung so desperately to the idea of remaining within those fences. To the Americans, these camps were meant as controlled spaces. To thousands of German women, they were islands of predictability in a world where predictability had vanished. All these angles, human, psychological, military, moral, and geopolitical, tightened together like threads in a rope. And soon they would pull taut, leading to a day when the tension between policy and desperation would break into open confrontation, marking the moment when the Americans realized they were no longer dealing with defeated civilians, but with people fighting quietly for their survival. The tension reached its height on a morning heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to press the air down on everyone beneath them. Orders had arrived from the regional command. Healthy civilians were to be processed and released. The camps needed space for the wounded, the sick, the displaced laborers arriving in growing waves. American officers understood the necessity, but the women inside the camp, who had only just regained a fragile sense of safety, did not. The announcement came shortly after breakfast. A line of soldiers moved across the yard, calling names from clipboards. Women were instructed to gather their belongings, small bundles of clothing, pieces of bread saved from the night before, a lone photograph tucked inside a coat. Children who had played quietly in the corners now clung to their mothers' skirts. As the first groups were guided toward the gate, unease spread through the crowd. The women looked at the guards, at the open world beyond the fence, then back at the place where they had slept in warmth for the first time in months. And suddenly, the quiet broke. Some stepped away from the line. Others shook their heads. A few cried out softly in German, voices trembling. The young American soldiers, confused, tried to reassure them with gestures and broken phrases. But reassurance was not what the women needed. Their fear ran deeper than the soldiers could understand. Leaving the camp meant returning to a town where water pumps were shattered, where looters moved in the shadows, where the nights were so dark and silent that even the creak of a door felt dangerous. Leaving meant returning to hunger, to uncertainty, to the ruins of a life that no longer felt like theirs. One woman pressed her palms together and approached the nearest guard. Her words came out trembling, not angry but pleading. Another pulled her child close as if the soldiers were taking something away rather than giving freedom back. A third refused to move at all, dropping to her knees in the dirt. Soon others followed, voices rising not as a mob but as a wave of desperation. This was not resistance, it was fear laid bare. The officers had anticipated reluctance. They had not anticipated this. A captain tried explaining through a translator that food distribution points had been set up in town, that order was slowly returning, that returning home was necessary for rebuilding. But the women shook their heads, repeating the same phrase again and again, some in German, some in broken English. Don't leave us here. The irony struck the officers immediately. They were being asked not to release people from a camp, but to let them stay. For a long moment, no one moved. The soldiers stood in tense silence, clutching their rifles awkwardly, unsure whether to enforce the order or step back. The women's faces told a story clearer than any briefing paper. They had reached their limit. They were not pleading out of manipulation or defiance. They were pleading because stepping beyond the fence felt like stepping back into danger. A young lieutenant, barely 22, later wrote that he had never seen fear like this on a battlefield. Soldiers feared death. These women feared life outside the wire. Word reached the commanding officer quickly. He walked to the yard, listening to the translator's murmured explanations, then to the soft, desperate voices rising around him. He understood that forcing them out by threat or force would provoke panic. It would also erode the trust that the Americans had been trying to build since the surrender. Yet the camp could not simply become a refuge for every civilian who preferred structure to chaos. He had to balance compassion with command, an impossible equation in a broken country. He made a decision, one that deviated from the rigidity of the original order. Instead of immediate removal, he arranged for temporary extensions. Women with infants or the elderly would remain until their local districts could confirm food distribution. Others would be escorted home in small groups, not released en masse. Patrols would accompany them to ensure safety, and ration cards would be issued directly, sparing them the dangerous walk through half-ruined streets to claim them. The officers' compromise calmed the crowd, but the emotional weight of the moment clung to every soldier who witnessed it. They realized that the collapse around them was not just physical, it was psychological. These women had lived through a world that taught them to fear the Allies, yet in the end it was the loss of any functioning society, any predictable structure that frightened them the most. The Americans now saw their mission differently. It was not simply occupation. It was holding together the thin threads of humanity in a place where everything familiar had turned to dust. The next days revealed the scale of the problem far more clearly than any officer expected. Once word spread that the Americans were allowing temporary stays, more civilians arrived, some cautiously, others in small groups led by neighbors who had heard that the camp offered warmth, an order the ruined towns could not provide. Women carried children with fevers, elderly parents unable to walk, and belongings wrapped in sheets because their suitcases had burned months ago. They approached the gates not with demands but with quiet desperation, asking only for a place where the nights no longer brought fear. American patrols reported the same pattern in every settlement they passed through, Collapsed roofs, empty pantries, wells fouled with debris, and families surviving on whatever could be scavenged from rubble. Without electricity, nights felt endless. Without police, even small crimes spread quickly. Without medical care, minor injuries turned dangerous. The war had ended, but for many civilians, the danger had not. The commanding officer knew the camp could not expand indefinitely. Its supplies were measured by tonnage, not hope. Its purpose was order, not asylum. But he also understood that releasing these civilians into towns unable to sustain them would undo everything the occupation was trying to stabilize. He walked the perimeter one morning, boots crunching in the gravel, watching women hang laundry between barracks and children kicking a dented can like a ball. The scene looked almost peaceful, too peaceful for a place meant to be temporary. He convened a meeting with senior staff. Maps were spread over a wooden table, covered in notes about destroyed water lines, uninhabitable districts, and food distribution points not yet functioning. The debate lasted hours. Some officers argued that the camp must hold firm to its purpose. Others insisted that immediate releases would cause suffering the army could prevent. The commanding officer listened silently until the room fell still. Then he laid out the decision that would define the camp's next chapter. Civilians would be released, but not blindly. Each family would receive escorted return, safety checks in their neighborhoods, and ration guarantees for the following weeks. Patrols would sweep through towns ahead of each returning group to ensure the streets were safe. No woman would be sent back alone. No child would walk back into a home colder than the camp barracks without assurance of help. This compromise reshaped everything. Over the next days, organized columns of civilians left the camp in small groups, each led by an American patrol. The women walked with mixed emotions, some relieved to be going home, others visibly afraid, but all understanding that they were not being abandoned. When they reached their towns, soldiers helped them assess the damage, locate wells that still worked, and secure any remaining supplies. Ration cards were distributed on the spot. For many women, this practical assistance mattered even more than the temporary refuge the camp had provided. It signaled that the Americans intended not only to occupy but to stabilize, not only to govern but to help rebuild. Yet even as the releases continued, a group of women remained inside the camp, those with newborns, with illness in the family, with homes too destroyed to return to. Their presence reminded the soldiers daily of the fragile line between policy and humanity. And though the camp gradually emptied, one image stayed with every man who had stood at the gate that first morning: the sound of German women pleading not to be freed from captivity, but to be spared the ruins waiting outside. It was a moment none of them would forget. Now, with the turning point resolved, the shape of the aftermath began to emerge, not only in the camp itself, but across the region still struggling to rise from the ashes. In the weeks that followed, the true aftermath of the camp episode unfolded quietly, not in dramatic scenes but in slow, steady shifts that reshaped entire communities. As soldiers continued their escorted returns, the surrounding towns gradually began to absorb their residents again. It was not easy. Many homes had no windows, no heat, no furniture that hadn't been scavenged or burned. But with American patrols checking routes, with food points operating under military supervision, and with order gradually restored, the towns no longer felt like the lawless no-man's lands they had been just days earlier. Some women adjusted quickly, stepping back into routines they remembered from before the war, cleaning rubble, boiling water, rebuilding makeshift kitchens in corners of rooms where the roof still held. Others struggled. They had grown accustomed to the predictability of the camp: meals at fixed hours, lights that stayed on through the night, guards who protected them from the unknown. Returning home required facing the remnants of their former lives, and for many that meant confronting silence, loss, and memories buried under debris. American officers noticed that some civilians walked into town with determination, while others needed gentle reassurance before they crossed their thresholds. Soldiers carried buckets of water into homes where the wells had not yet been cleared, or helped elderly residents move furniture that had survived the bombings. In several neighborhoods, children followed the patrols eagerly, seeing them as the only constant source of security during uncertain days. Military reports reflected an unexpected pattern. The more structured help the civilians received, the less dependent they remained on the camps. The officer who had made the decision to alter the release procedure saw his strategy validated. By giving civilians not just freedom but a practical foundation, food, safety checks, and the sense that somebody cared, the Americans helped them reconnect with their towns rather than flee from them. Still, the memory of that morning at the camp stayed present. Guards who once expected hostility now approached their duties with a deeper understanding of the human toll left behind by the collapse of the Reich. Their discipline did not soften, but their perspective widened. They saw not an enemy population but a society in ruins trying to stand again. As order returned slowly, the camp itself changed. Fewer locals arrived at the gates. Rumors that had once brought civilians seeking safety now faded, replaced by word that towns were receiving regular supplies again. Schools opened in damaged buildings. Churches held services even without full roofs. For many families, the first warm meal shared at home marked the turning point, the moment when the chaos of war gave way to the beginnings of ordinary life. Yet the camp did not become irrelevant. It shifted back to its intended purpose, focusing again on displaced persons, the sick, and those with no homes left at all. Officers who once struggled to balance compassion and policy now found a clearer path forward. They had seen firsthand how fragile recovery could be and how crucial structured support was in a world trying to rise from devastation. The memory of women pleading to stay was not dismissed. It became part of the internal reports circulated within the occupation administration, shaping guidelines about civilian assistance and the pace of reconstruction. It taught the Americans that rebuilding a country was not simply a matter of issuing orders or distributing rations, but of understanding fear, trauma, and the need for stability in the aftermath of destruction. As summer approached, the towns around the camp began to show subtle signs of life: market stalls reopening, children playing along cleared sidewalks, smoke rising from chimneys repaired with scrap materials. It was far from a restored Germany, but it was no longer a Germany drowning in collapse. And at the heart of that fragile transition was the moment when women, broken by war but desperate for safety, showed the occupying forces what true instability looked like, and what it would take to overcome it. As the occupation months unfolded, the broader consequences of that episode became clearer. The women who had begged to stay in the camp were not isolated cases. They represented an entire population emerging from the shock of a collapsed state. American administrators soon realized that the psychological impact of the war would shape post-war Germany just as powerfully as physical destruction. Reports circulated through the command network noting that civilian fear remained high even in regions untouched by direct combat. The collapse of institutions, police, transport, rationing offices had produced a vacuum no military force could fill instantly. To respond to this, the Americans strengthened the system they had begun by necessity during the camp incident. Patrol units were reorganized to provide regular oversight in the most damaged neighborhoods, not as punitive forces but as stabilizing presences. Medical corps expanded their visits to outlying villages, offering vaccinations and basic treatments. Agricultural officers worked with remaining farmers to secure harvests and prevent shortages. Even small steps like ensuring that bakery ovens were repaired or that local wells were disinfected carried symbolic weight. They reminded civilians that the world was no longer spinning toward collapse. For the women who had stayed in the camp the longest, those with infants or families too weak to move, the eventual return home was gentler than they had feared. They stepped into houses that still bore scars of fire or shrapnel, but the presence of patrols on the streets and the knowledge that ration points were functioning offered a kind of reassurance. They began the slow work of clearing debris, patching walls, and washing soot from what remained of their belongings. Neighbors who had once lived in fear behind locked doors began to speak again over shared chores or borrowed tools. The fragile threads of community started to reform. American officers watched these changes with cautious optimism. They had entered the war expecting to fight a military enemy. They discovered they had inherited a humanitarian crisis. The incident in the camp became a quiet lesson among the ranks, repeated in briefings and remembered during patrols. Hard rules were necessary, but compassion, administered firmly and with structure, could prevent panic, dependency, and despair. It could turn chaotic crowds into communities capable of rebuilding. It could transform occupied territory into places where cooperation was possible. By late summer, the camp that once served as a reluctant haven for German civilians had settled back into its intended function. New arrivals were mostly displaced persons from Eastern Europe or forced laborers waiting for transport home. The German women who had once pleaded to remain now visited the gates only during scheduled supply distributions or medical checks. They no longer asked to stay. Their fear had shifted. It had not vanished, war leaves long shadows, but it no longer dictated every step. The towns around the camp began to show signs of recovery, slow but unmistakable. Gardens were planted in bombed-out courtyards, workshops reopened with salvaged tools, makeshift schools gathered children in cleaned-out basements. Evening fires glowed behind mended windows as families, for the first time in years, prepared meals without fearing the sky. The memory of the war was everywhere, but so was the first fragile hope that life could be rebuilt. The Americans, for their part, continued to learn as they governed. The pleas of the women that morning had revealed something fundamental. The occupation was not just a matter of military authority, but of guiding a traumatized population back toward stability. The soldiers who had stood unsure at the gate now understood why the women had begged, and why the camp had felt like sanctuary. And they carried that understanding into every decision they made as Germany moved, inch by inch, out of collapse and toward the long, slow work of recovery. In the stillness that settled over Germany in the months after surrender, the incident at the camp remained a quiet marker of what the war had truly done to its people. History often remembers the battles, the strategies, the leaders who shaped the course of nations. But moments like the one when German women begged not to be released from an American camp revealed a different truth, one not written in military reports or political speeches, but in the fragile condition of ordinary human lives caught between collapse and survival. Their plea did not come from loyalty to any side or from fear of the Americans themselves. It came from a deeper place, the instinct to cling to the first structure that felt safe after the world around them had dissolved. Behind the wire there was order, light routine, simple things that had once been taken for granted. Outside it, there was a landscape broken not only by bombs, but by the disappearance of every familiar institution that once protected daily life. The women were not choosing captivity, they were choosing predictability in a world that had stopped offering it. For the American soldiers who heard those words, the moment forced a shift in understanding. Victory, they realized, did not end with the silencing of guns. It continued in the work of holding together a shattered society, of helping those who had been enemies only weeks earlier reclaim a sense of belonging in a landscape turned unrecognizable. The responsibility was larger than occupation. It was stewardship, carried out one cautious step at a time. And for the women themselves, the episode became a symbol of the war's final chapter. Not the roar of artillery or the shouts of retreating armies, but the quieter struggle to redefine safety and rebuild dignity after everything had fallen apart. Their plea "don't leave us here" was not a cry for shelter behind wire, but a plea for a pause in a world moving too quickly from terror into uncertainty. In the years that followed, the camps closed, the patrols ended, and Germany rebuilt itself into something new. But the memory of that morning endured as a reminder that the end of a war is never simply the end of fighting. It is the beginning of understanding how deeply instability can reshape the human spirit, and how powerful even the smallest acts of structure and compassion can be in helping people rise again.